Good evening. I'm Adrienne Northington, Executive Director of the Foundation of Wayne Community College, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our first Arts and Humanities lecture of our 2021 spring series. We will have 5 lectures in the month of March on each Monday evening. This evening, we are fortunate to have Dr. Mary Floyd-Wilson to present A Plague of Both Your Houses, Causation and Contagion in Romeo and Juliet. Our audience will have an opportunity to ask Dr. Floyd-Wilson questions by posting them in the chat feature of YouTube. Please sign in and make comments and post your questions throughout the lecture. If you have not used the chat feature before, you will be prompted to create a channel name if you have a Gmail account. If you have a different email account, YouTube will guide you through the sign-in process. It's a great way to interact in our virtual environment. Tonight's lecture is held in collaboration with Carolina Public Humanities, a part of the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. To introduce our speaker, we have with us from Carolina Public Humanities, Joanna Smith, the Associate Director of State Outreach. Joanna is a champion of all things arts and humanities, a supporter of our endeavors here, and a good friend. We thank you both for making the trip from Chapel Hill to be with us tonight, and we look forward to this fascinating topic. Joanna?
Hello, everyone, and thank you for that warm welcome, Adrienne. It's my pleasure to be here with you tonight. And I want to take a moment up front to extend a special thank you to the Foundation of Wayne Community College for your partnership with Carolina Public Humanities on collaborations like tonight's event. Especially during this year of new challenges, it has been an encouragement and an inspiration to be working with a team so committed to bringing the arts and humanities to public audiences and so committed to supporting K-12 educators. So to all of the Foundation supporters, as well as to Charlotte, Adrienne, Diane, Emily, and the rest of the team that makes the wheels turn over here, I want to convey an enormous thank you on behalf of Carolina Public Humanities. And now it's my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Dr. Mary Floyd-Wilson. Dr. Floyd-Wilson is the Bowman and Gordan Gray Distinguished Term Professor and Department Chair in English and Comparative Literature at UNC-Chapel Hill. And her history with UNC goes back to her own graduate education. She received first her MA and then her doctorate from UNC-Chapel Hill in 1996. After graduating, she taught at Yale for a number of years before returning to Chapel Hill. At UNC, Dr. Floyd-Wilson has taught surveys of English literature, along with courses on Shakespeare, English Renaissance drama, and Shakespeare's Women in Context. She's the recipient of numerous awards, including recently her second fellowship at the National Humanities Center. Mary Floyd-Wilson works in the field of early modern English literature, primarily focusing on drama placed in cultural, social, and intellectual contexts. Her past projects have included readings of Shakespeare's Othello, Cymbeline, and Macbeth, Ben Jonson's Masque of Blackness, and Christopher Marlowe's Tamburlaine in relation to the period's understanding of ethnological differences. Her work is also focused on the sympathies and antipathies, occult knowledge, and the construction of science in the early modern period. And her work on the history of emotion helped to initiate the affective turn in early modern literary scholarship. Tonight, Dr. Floyd-Wilson will be presenting on the topic of the plague in Romeo and Juliet, which I believe is a theme that she began working on well before the pandemic pushed it to the forefront of most of our minds. In 2017, she authored an essay titled Angry Mab with Blister's Plague, the Pre-Modern Science of Contagion in Romeo and Juliet, which was published in the Palgrave Handbook to Early Modern Literature, Science, and Culture. And in 2019, she was also the co-editor of another Palgrave collection of essays titled Contagion and the Shakespearean Stage. She's currently working on a book titled The Tempter or the Tempted, Demonic Causality on the Shakespearean Stage, about the distinct influence of the Protestant devil in early modern culture. Now, I hope you'll all join me from wherever you are tonight in welcoming Dr. Mary Floyd-Wilson.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Joanna, for that very kind introduction, and thank you to the Carolina Public Humanities for your great programming. And I'm so pleased to learn more about the partnership between Carolina Public Humanities and the Wayne Community College Foundation. And I'm very grateful and appreciative that the foundation has invited me here today to give this talk. Thanks to Andrea Northington, who's the executive director. It's lovely to meet you today. Thanks to Emily Bird, who is here to assist and help me with the questions this evening. And I'm also grateful to Charlotte Brow, the Director of Arts and Humanities here. So thank you so much for having me. So this is the first time that I have given this particular lecture, so I am really eager to have the questions. So do pose questions. There may be gaps or things that I don't explain, and so it's really helpful to me to hear from you and to let me know where you want sort of more explication. So I want to begin with a very famous speech in Romeo and Juliet. It's delivered by Mercutio, and critics have really struggled with it quite a bit. It's known as the Queen Mab speech, and I've excerpted parts of it here. So Mercutio is speaking in response to Romeo's statement that he has had a dream. And in response to the statement, Mercutio gives this long monologue, and I'm going to read parts of it here just so we have it in our minds. "Oh, then I see Queen Mab hath been with you. She is the fairies' midwife, and she comes in shape no bigger than an agate stone on the forefinger of an alderman, drawn with a team of little atomies athwart men's noses as they lie asleep. And in this state she gallops, night by night, through lovers' brains, and then they dream of love, or courtiers' knees that dream on curtsies straight, or lawyers' fingers who straight dream on fees, or ladies' lips who straight on kisses dream, which oft the angry Mab with blisters plagues, because their breasts with sweetmeats tainted are. This is that very Mab that plats the manes of horses in the night, and bakes the elf locks in foul sluttish hairs, which once untangled, much misfortune bodes. This is the hag, when maids lie on their backs, that presses them, and learns them first to bear, making them women of good carriage. This is she." So critics have struggled with Mercutio's Queen Mab speech because they're not quite sure how to reconcile it to the rest of the play. To some, it seems like an outburst of fantastic poetry, but arbitrary and unconnected to what occurs in the plot of the play. In fact, what Romeo says in response to Mercutio's speech is, "Peace, thou talkst of nothing." But there are some scholars who have looked back at this speech who are particularly interested in traces of the history of science in early modern literature, and they have suggested, I think rather provocatively, that Mercutio actually offers a vision that anticipates the unseen and infinitesimal worlds which the very first microscopes would discover some 30 years later. As one scholar, Jennifer Iles, puts it, by figuring the originator of dreams as an external creature that is small, almost at the atomic level of germs and bacteria, and which invades the larger corpus without impunity, Shakespeare provides a pseudo-medical discourse of infection that is closer to what medical scientists now know and postulate about the spread of disease. While it is true that Romeo and Juliet is one of the few plays in Shakespeare's era to put on stage the actual presence of the plague in the community, it is also true that medical experts in the period simply did not conceive of diseases as individual entities, much less as substances that operated on an atomic level of germs and microbes. And yet Mercutio's story of Queen Mab, a well-known fairy in the period, does actually provide us with a Renaissance view of how infection might spread. For in a culture that understood the plague in supernatural terms as a punishment sent by God, many medical writers in the period suggested that it was invisible demonic spirits that were the agents of contagion. So in what scholars call the early modern period, which is in this case the late 16th century, almost every discussion of plague establishes that the first cause of pestilence is divine wrath. God, however, may work through a whole variety of forces, including the influence of the stars or the way of environmental effects, such as bad air. But no one disputes the supernatural sanction as the primary trigger of any kind of epidemic of plague. So some writers explain that God may intervene directly by sending angels or devils to plague sinful communities. One reformist writer, for example, Theodore Bayes, says that God sends the plague by way of angels who then operate through natural causes, for they have, whether good or bad, the power to stir up the minds of men. According to another plague writer, William Cupper, the main way to cure the plague is to, quote, chase far away from thee the wicked and unclean spirits which are sent of God to poison and destroy men with the pestilence. And then in the passage that I've quoted here from Spiritual Preservatives Against the Pestilence, Henry Holland explains how wicked spirits function as agents of contagion in a way that I think corresponds to some degree with Mercutio's account of Queen Mab. These spirits persuade by marvelous and invisible means, piercing by reason of their airy, thin bodies, the bodies of men when they perceive it not, and so confounding and mingling themselves by means of some imaginations conceived with the motions of their mind, both waking and sleeping. So I think it's important to note here that according to Reformation theologians, there would really be no such thing as an innocent or autonomous fairy creature. Instead, anything that, say, the lay folk might identify as a fairy would have in fact been a demon, subservient to Satan and bent on the spiritual destruction of mankind. By stirring the mind, as these quotations suggest, or creating imaginative conceptions, spirits, it was believed, were also producing illnesses. In fact, for Shakespeare's audience, the very word fairy would have been associated with the idea of a malignant disease of spiritual origin. Folk healers, in fact, often diagnosed a supernatural cause for a patient's malady by saying, this person has been haunted by an evil spirit or a ghost or a fairy, or they have been bewitched. If we examine herbal books from the period, we can find recipes for preventing fairy maladies. So William Langham's The Garden of Health, published in 1597, states that the roots and seeds of the peony should be worn around the neck to prevent the haunting of the fairies and the goblins. Moreover, the earlier common meaning of plague itself is to afflict with evil. It's regularly used in discourses on witchcraft in the period to describe the maleficium of witches or hags who send their familiar spirits to plague their neighbors. So as Mercutio exclaims, an angry Mab plagues ladies' lips with blisters, tormenting them out of sheer spite, with physical marks that resemble the plague's swelling physical symptoms. Later in the period, another poet, Michael Drayton, describes Mab's visitations in very similar terms. And Mab, his merry queen by night, bestrids young folks that lie upright. In elder times, the mare that height, which plagues them out of measure. So Queen Mab's association here in Drayton's poem with the mare also suggests a kind of succubus, kind of fairy visiting. So this passage echoes Mercutio's description then of the hag when maids lie on their backs that presses them and learns them first to bear, making them women of good carriage, which is an allusion to sex and then the resulting pregnancy. So Renaissance writers often interpreted the mare either as a disease or as a malevolent spirit. Some argued that merely by lying on one's back, you were exposed to all kinds of things like leprosy, madness, or an incubus, or a nightmare that felt like strangling in one's sleep from the sense of a heavy weight resting on one's stomach. One Renaissance writer calls the disease both the hag and the incubus and argues that it is a sign of more illnesses to come. Another writer indicates that some evil spirits go into the beds of women at night to, quote, oppress them, striving to have carnal company with them. But he also notes that these feelings could be attributed to a natural disease that leads one to imagine that he or she has been visited by a spirit. A third writer captures the uncertainty as to whether such an experience has been prompted by an evil spirit or a natural disease when he suggests that if a child wears, quote, a peony seed, then no evil spirit can hinder him, and yet the same seed will protect one from the disease called the incubus, that is also called the mare. So when Mercutio describes dreams as begot of nothing but vain fantasy, which is as thin of substance as the air, he suggests that Mab and her fairies are both material and imaginary, simultaneously produced by the environment as well as by the sleeper's idle dreams and brains. So as I shall now demonstrate, 16th and 17th century theories about the transmission of the plague are very similar, for they too combine both external and internal causes. So, as I suggested before, there is a generalization among Shakespeare critics that Renaissance playwrights were reluctant to represent the plague in their drama. So one of the questions I would like for us to consider today is, if we read the Queen Mab speech as a narrative about supernatural contagion, how does it affect how we interpret the presence of the plague in Romeo and Juliet? Obviously, Mercutio's curse, a plague on both your houses, reminds us of the epidemic's presence. And of course, Friar John's inability to deliver a letter to Romeo due to the inconvenience of quarantine affects the outcome of the plot. But can an understanding of 16th century plague discourse help us generate a reading of Romeo and Juliet that moves us beyond these isolated moments? First, I want to challenge the assumption that playwrights were disinclined to present the plague on stage. I think instead is that we need to comprehend how early modern audiences understood the plague before we attempt to discern its presence in plays. It's important to recognize, first and foremost, that plague was not understood to be an entity in and of itself. So as the plague historian Paul Slack explains, neither the illiterate nor the educated viewed the plague as a distinct entity to be studied in isolation. They had interpreted it instead as part of the natural order, or more accurately, as part of the unnatural disorder of things. Now, certainly it is commonplace in modern medicine to catalog diseases as having separate historical identities. But early modern writers perceived pestilence primarily as an effect of corruption, or as the consequence of material and spiritual putrefaction, so as all part of the natural order. Indeed, the more one reads early modern plague treatises, which is something I do in my spare time, the more apparent it becomes that writers rarely treat plague as a thing, but focus instead on presenting a complex hierarchy of causation. Supernatural, preternatural, and natural causes all working together were thought to generate plague epidemics. As Slack observes, these discussions of causation embodied all the cosmological assumptions which prevailed before the scientific innovations of the 17th century. And as medical writer Margaret Pelling explains, the Renaissance medical treatises provided an elaborate structure of explanation involving this hierarchy of causes. So repeatedly, and systematically, plague treatises put forth 4 causes: divine punishment, astral and planetary influence, bad air, and the internal physiological imbalance or the corruption of individual persons. So any conflicting views of contagion tended to be, in effect, concentrating on one among many possible range of causes at the expense of others. For the discourse as a whole suggests that plague was the consequence of a conspiracy of causes. It's difficult, I think, for modern readers to understand how a manifestation of a disease might be attributed simultaneously to external, internal, supernatural, and natural influences. But plague discourse, I think, also suggests that these discussions of causation do not simply provide an explanatory structure for the spread of pestilence. They also intensify widespread questions about causation in general. When and how does God work through natural means? What role do the stars play in our behavior or our fate? Why do some people suffer and others do not? How do we understand the relationship between predisposition and external contamination? Although pestilence as an epidemic may only haunt the borders of Romeo and Juliet, plague discourse and its hierarchy of causes does in fact shape the play's presentation of its tragic story. Characters repeatedly attribute consequences and actions to various and seemingly contradictory forces. The lovers are simultaneously directed by the stars, by their own intemperance, by local influences, and cosmological forces. What I am arguing is that plague habits of thought profoundly shape Shakespeare's representation of how the lovers in their community interpret the experiences of vitality, love, contagion, and death. So modern commentators on the history of disease have often cited the Renaissance medical writers Paracelsus and Fracastoro as 2 central figures in the development of early modern contagion theory. Some have argued that it was Fracastoro who first established that epidemic diseases could be spread over distances by minuscule agents of infection, which he called primary seeds of contagion. And scholars have also observed that Paracelsus constructed disease as a, quote, entity in its own right, where origins lie outside the body in a foreign invader. I'm quoting a critic there. But to grasp how early moderns understood disease transmission, we need to wrestle with the less familiar and more peculiar assertions made by Paracelsus and Fracastoro. Fracastoro indicates, for example, that the primary seeds of contagion seek out and adhere to the humor, the bodily humor, for which they feel a natural affinity. So it's giving agency then to these seeds of contagion. At the foundation of his concept of contagion is a general principle of sympathy. So objects only interact with substances which have a similar constitution. Like is attracted to like. In turn, Paracelsus's analysis of the plague emphasizes a reciprocal relationship between man and heaven. Plague treatises establish that the onset of pestilence is never simply supernatural or natural, nor is it generated only from within or from without. What is most complicated about the causation of plague is this conspiracy of intersecting forces. An inclination within the body corresponds and responds to a corruption from without the body. The prologue to Romeo and Juliet makes no direct mention of the plague. However, it does establish that the play's tragic events stem from a conspiracy of causes that echoes the plague's treatises. I'm going to read the prologue to you here. 2 households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona where we lay our scene. From ancient grudge break to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. From forth the fatal loins of these 2 foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life. whose misadventured, piteous overthrows do with their death bury their parents' strife. The fearful passage of their death-marked love and the continuance of their parents' rage, which but their children's end not could remove, is now the 2 hours' traffic of our stage, the which, if you with patient ears attend, what here shall miss, our toil shall strive to mend. So the family feud seems to have traceable origins in a dispute or a betrayal, this ancient grudge, but it characterizes this ancient grudge as an erupting force, almost like a plague, which lies fallow until it breaks to new mutiny. We should note that London's plague worked in the same way. It was not singular, but it was constant. It was a presence that would ebb and flow throughout the years, never quite disappearing. Curiously, it is not differences that have produced the conflict between the Capulets and the Montagues, but an inexplicable and equally pernicious rage that afflicts both families. In stressing how alike the households are, the chorus suggests that the families function as sympathetic doubles or mirrored images, reminding us perhaps of the sympathies and similitudes that mark early modern ideas of contagion. Two households, both alike, and two foes with undifferentiated fatal loins. These loins produced Romeo and Juliet as a pair, as though the lovers themselves are twins. In the same way that the plague treatises established that corrupted air generated by evil stars could infect a community, the star-crossed lovers are death-marked. If the origins of their parents' strife remains obscured or hidden, the chorus does assert that their children's death will remove the rage it has produced. The notion of a scapegoat or a sacrifice invokes the supernatural cause of plague as a punishment by God, which the phrase fatal loins also underscores, suggesting that the parents' sins are visited upon their children. And this is, in fact, what the friar claims. When Juliet appears to have died in her bed, he says, "The heavens do lower upon you for some ill." Most resonant, I think, is this term rage. This word was used repeatedly in plague treatises to characterize the disease's destructive spread. So identifying the lovers as death-marked not only anticipates their tragic fate, but also associates them with the physical signs of pestilence, which appeared on the victims themselves. Searchers, who were the group of people, women, who would go into the houses of the quarantined and identify what people had died of by looking at their bodies, they would search for blisters or buboes upon the sufferers' bodies, which, according to medical writers, functioned as God's tokens or signs of the illness. Moreover, when infected, households were quarantined. Their doors were marked then with a red cross. People who came from plague houses had to wear black or white lace on their hats to identify them. To prevent the spread of bad air, a quarantined house was typically shut up for 40 days. Historian Paul Slack has shown people would attempt to avoid quarantine by smuggling plague corpses out of the back door to bury them in the gardens at night. Quarantine not only proved financially challenging, but the confinement of healthy and infected members of the household together was really a virtual death sentence. Indeed, one early modern physician reports that the imprisoned inhabitants of one house could be seen crying and roaring at their windows. When the Dr. Simon Foreman became ill, his entire family was confined with him as well. Foreman observed that his neighbors believed that it was, quote, better that I and my household should starve and die than that any of them be put in danger. In other words, the marking of the pestilent household predicted the deaths of those within, even before the inhabitants became ill. To feel death-marked, or an impending sense of doom, may have been the predominant sentiment when the plague raged in London. So in 1593, just before Shakespeare wrote Romeo and Juliet, about 12% of London's population had died of plague. The ebb and flow of pestilence seems also to have produced a prognostic element in plague discourse. If people can predict when the plague death figures will rise in the bills of mortality, then they can plan their escape from the city. The early modern writer Simon Kelway states, that when we see the fiery impressions in the firmament, especially in the end of summer as comets and such like, it showeth the air to be corrupt, and the plague shortly after to follow. They also thought that the presence of toads and gnats and moths and spiders were predictors of the coming of the plague. Even more strangely, writers suggested that groups of children playing together in the streets could be a sign of plague. In other words, almost anything could produce a premonition of death. In Shakespeare's tragedy, the plague has already afflicted Mantua, so it is not surprising to find that Verona's citizens feel a dread of imminent misfortune. When Romeo tells Mercutio he had dreamt a dream tonight, and Mercutio responds with his Queen Mab narrative, the account he gives not only mimics ideas of contagion, but it also reminds us that dreams could function as prognostications. As if prompted by Queen Mab, Romeo prophesizes his own untimely death. My mind misgives, some consequence yet hanging in the stars shall bitterly begin his fearful date with this night's revels, and expire the term of despised life closed in my breast, and some vile forfeit of untimely death. So it may strike us as odd that Romeo believes that the influential stars carry his own expiration date before he even meets Juliet. The consequence that hangs in the stars could be destiny, it could be fate, it could be the stars' more material corrupting forces. And later, Juliet too has an ill-divining vision, for when Romeo leaves their marriage bed, she exclaims, "Methinks I see thee, now thou art so low, as one dead in the bottom of a tomb." So most critics interpret the lover's foreboding as evidence of the Liebestod motif, or the theme of erotic death, this mingling of both death and sex. But it is also likely that in a plague culture, young people might simply be obsessed with mortality. When Juliet's father, Capulet, laments that, quote, "the earth has swallowed all my hopes except for Juliet," it is unclear whether he is referring to the feud or to the devastating effects of the plague. Certainly an epidemic would be a more common cause of high fatalities. In contemporary writer Thomas Deckert's treatise of the Wonderful Year, a treatise about plague, he uses very similar imagery to convey the rapid loss of life during a plague outbreak. 100 hungry graves stand gaping, and every one of them, as at breakfast, has swallowed down 10 or 11 lifeless carcasses. Before dinner, in the same gulf, are twice so many more devoured, and before the sun takes his rest, those numbers are doubled. But the earth's capacity to swallow people could also refer to an early modern theory of contagion, for infection was attributed primarily to the corrupt air emitted by open graves and cesspools and putrefying groundwater. So as the plague writer Stephen Bradwell explains, noisome vapors arising from filthy sinks, stinking sewers, channels, gutters, privies, sluggish corners, dunghills, and uncast ditches, as also the mists and fogs that commonly arise out of the fens, moors, mines, and standing lakes, do greatly corrupt the air, and in like manner, the lying of dead, rotting carrions in channels, ditches, and dunghills cause a contagious air. So Romeo's sense of a looming death returns again and again in the play. He equates his banishment to Mantua to death, which is a reasonable conclusion given that Mantua has been stricken by the plague. Indeed, Romeo has been cast out of the city as though he were some kind of infectious source. And cities regularly did refuse entrance to strangers for fear of contamination. As the nurse articulates it, banishment might as well be death, for she tells Juliet to marry Paris because her first husband is dead, or 'twere as good as he were. In the same way that the quarantined were as good as dead, those who attempted to flee the city often found that the plague had followed them. Much plague writing concerns the moral rectitude of leaving one's family and home to escape the corruption in the city. But writers typically emphasize the futility of flight, for the plague and God could strike you down as you go. Indeed, plague culture produces questions about vitality, or the very nature of life itself. While the quarantined or the contaminated live under a death sentence, apparent corpses could also prove to be alive. The problem of when to bury plague victims captures the ambiguous nature of vitality. As historian Mary Lindemann observes, no fewer than 24 hours were to elapse before burying those who died of plague, but to prevent being buried alive. But to avoid further contamination, all bodies were to be underground within 28 hours. So the sick might be paralyzed or speechless and then easily mistaken for the dead. Plague writer Johann von Ewig articulates the difficulty of hitting on the exact right time for burial so that it is done neither too slowly nor too hastily. Sometimes he acknowledges bodies were mistaken for the dead. But we're not yet dead indeed. We know some to have been drawn to their grave by the hands of the buriers half alive, others of the nobles to have been put into their sepulchres whose life as yet lay hid in the corners of the heart. One of the noble matrons so buried, namely at Venice, a little after was seen dead, who notwithstanding sitting up and removed from her place among the dead carcasses had revived, whereof her torn hair and breast rent with her nails were a great token. Alas, how often being alive among the dead did she call upon the gods in vain. So Shakespeare's contemporary, Thomas Middleton, in his treatise, The Meeting of Gallants, tells several anecdotes of sort of macabre humor about how the searchers, in particular, would mistake the living for the dead. And as I've told you before, the searchers were the ones who were hired by parishes and who had the job of going from house to house to determine what the cause of death is after examining the corpses. In one of Middleton's stories, the searchers are mistakenly informed that a man has died, and when they come to his house asking for the dead body and in what room it lay, the corpse himself answers them. They are startled, and they believe that the man is new risen. And then, as if cursed by the false rumor and the searcher's visit, the young man actually dies several days later. In another story, they find a drunk lying in the middle of the road, and they believe he's died of plague. Fearing that his body would then infect all the air around, they proceed to burn out the infection as he lies. And once he feels the flames, he jumps up and asks to be quenched with double beer immediately. So the sort of dark humor of these tales points not only to anxieties about death from the plague, but also to the difficulties of detecting liveness. So most obviously, in Shakespeare's tragedy, Juliet's death-like sleep confuses the borders between life and death. As the friar intends, Juliet's own family misreads her body as a corpse, and she is subsequently buried alive. The misconstruction of vitality is not limited to Juliet's artificial or well-staged death, for it speaks really to a more general fear of not knowing how to know when a corpse is a corpse. While in Mantua, Romeo has a dream that Juliet will discover him dead. I dreamt my lady came and found me dead. Strange dream that gives a dead man leave to think, and breathes such life with kisses in my lips that I revived and was an emperor. So Romeo recognizes how strange it is to possess consciousness as a dead man, but his uncanny status as a thinking corpse exemplifies this liminality of vitality. Juliet's capacity in his dream to breathe life into him with kisses foreshadows her incapacity to do so when she finds him in the tomb. In this later moment of despair, she equates death with life, conflating the poison on his lips with the restorative power of his living kisses. Once we understand that in a plague environment, there is a pervasive fear of being buried alive, but also a fear of being infected with the plague by the rotting corpses, we should see that Juliet's willingness to be placed among the dead in her family's tomb is not simply gruesome, but profoundly heroic. Following Romeo's banishment, Juliet visits the friar to find a remedy to their separation. Begging for a solution, she swears herself ready to risk or endure any danger, and she lists serpents and bears, and then she caps these oaths with the ghoulish bid that she be hidden in a charnel house or covered quite with dead men's rattling bones, with reeky shanks and yellow chapless skulls, or bid me go into a new-made grave and hide me with a dead man in his tomb. So modern readers might interpret her offer, as a brave proposal to face common psychological fears. Juliet is in fact willing to expose herself to assured death, for the bad air and noisome vapors of decomposing bodies were presumed to be the most common source of plague infection. Her description anticipates Thomas Decker's plague treatise, where he argues that the whole city of London during the plague had become a charnel house. What an unmatchable torment were it for a man to be barred up every night in a vast silent charnel house, thickly mingled with heaps of dead men's bones, the bare ribs of a father that begat him lying there, here the chapless hollow skull of a mother that bore him, mandrakes shrieking, even in such formidable shape did the diseased city appear in. So the friar does seem to take his cue from Juliet's willingness to be among the dead when he devises the plan to have her buried alive in her family's tomb. Now, this speech is often cut from play productions, but Juliet gives a very long soliloquy before she ingests the friar's sleeping potion, which explicitly acknowledges the dangers of quarantine. So I'm going to read this to you. How if when I am laid into the tomb I wake before the time that Romeo come to redeem me? There's a fearful point. Shall I not then be stifled in the vault, to whose foul mouth no healthsome air breathes in, and there die strangled ere my Romeo comes? The bones of all my buried ancestors are packed where bloody Tybalt, yet but green in earth, lies festering in his shroud, where, as they say, at some hours in the night spirits resort. Alack, alack, it is not like that I, so early waking, what with loathsome smells and shrieks like mandrakes torn out of the earth, that living mortals, hearing them, run mad. So in the same way that healthy members of a family might be locked away with the sick or recently dead, Juliet fears that she will be stifled in the vault, trapped among the festering, where no healthsome air breathes in. She will be strangled, or worse, subject to a rage. Certainly the loathsome smells promise disease, but it is not only corpses Juliet fears, she is also afraid of spirits who haunt the dark. For such spirits as Mercutio implied could infect her before she is rescued. Juliet agrees to the friar's plan because she trusts him as an advisor on physical and spiritual remedies. Indeed, the play establishes that friars play a central caregiving role in a community afflicted by the plague. So like the other brothers of his order, the friar would necessarily visit and treat the sick. And this is brought home when we learn that Friar John is delayed in doing just that when the searchers of the town quarantine him and an unnamed associate. Since the other barefoot brother was in the city visiting the sick, it is no surprise that he and Friar John had been to a house where the infectious pestilence did reign. So in his initial soliloquy, the friar establishes his expertise as a health practitioner who understands the true qualities of plants, herbs, and stones. I'm not going to read this whole soliloquy, but at the bottom you can see towards the bottom you can see the lines that I'm quoting. So even the plague treatises that emphasize the disease's supernatural causation also acknowledge that God gives us natural remedies to counteract it. The Lord hath created medicine of the earth, a given great virtue unto trees, herbs, gums, stones, and minerals, and all for the help of his people in the time of their sickness. So when it momentarily occurs to Juliet that the sleeping potion that the friar has provided for her may be a poison, her stem fears from a comprehension that medical treatments encompassed both cures and toxins. The plague was actually understood to be a poison. Thus, many argued that the way to prevent it and treat it was to understand how poisons worked on the body. As the friar has explained, poisons could function as remedies, not so vile that on the earth does live, but to the earth some special good doth give, he says. And he gathers both baleful weeds and precious juiced flowers. Indeed, some contemporary plague therapies called for wearing arsenic amulets, following this principle of like treating like, for one poison was thought to drive out the other. This is, in fact, Benvolio's logic when he tells Romeo that he could eradicate his love for Rosaline. Remember that prior baggage before he meets Juliet. By taking some new infection to his eye. So this notion that you treat poison with poison, drive one out with the other, was commonplace. So the friar does not simply recognize that within a weak flower, poison hath residence and medicine power, but he also draws an analogy between men and plants. Two such opposed kings encamp them still, in man as well as herbs, grace and rude will. And where the worser is predominant, full soon the canker death eats up that plant. So this correspondence between man's sinful nature and the flower's poisonous parts represents a general understanding of spiritual and moral degeneracy. But more significantly, it articulates the least familiar aspect of early modern contagion theory, which is that the plague ultimately finds a habitation in a body that's already inclined to receive it. As scholar Lynette Hunter has shown, Romeo and Juliet's repeated references to cankers as closed over ulcerous wounds and that canker worm that consumes the plant from inside the stem captures the plague's status as both an internal contamination and an external infection. Plague writers often compared the disease to a canker for its capacity to, quote, eateth up all things that are next unto it. What modern readers may miss, however, is that cankers, or worms, were thought to grow spontaneously out of corrupted sources. So it was widely held that toads, lice, worms, and other creatures were generated, as I said, by fetid standing pools. Moreover, as we mentioned before, early modern writers had argued that the increase in the production of these creatures, of flies and worms and toads, was a sure sign that the plague was near. Similarly, early moderns believed that worms could grow in human bodies without an external cause. As one medical writer observes, worms are preternatural things bred in the body. In a plague culture, people do not simply fear infection, they fear how their own internal corruption or even moral decay could invite infection. In Romeo and Juliet, these fears produce a habit of thought in which the living are cast as the walking dead. When banished, Romeo imagines Juliet's body as a putrefying corpse, more accessible to carrion flies than to his own touch. In much the same way, when Juliet refuses to marry Paris, her own father dismisses her as green sickness carrion, which suggests that she is a rotting virgin, poisoned from within by the venom of her own putrefied menstrual blood. For green sickness was understood to be a uterine affliction of young unmarried virgins, for which the cure was sex. In another plague treatise, News from the Grave's End, Thomas Dekker attributes the cause of plague to the fact that every man within him feeds a worm which this contagion breeds. In other words, man's internal corruption of sin breeds a physical worm that attracts the contagion of plague. As plague writer Peter Druitt argues, when the secret poison of plague infects, it is necessary that there be some natural likeness between the thing agent and the patient. In a similar way, Thomas Lodge contends that infection takes place because the contagion is no other thing but a like disposition by a certain hidden consent communicated by touch unto the other. This idea of sympathetic contagion, in which a body is predisposed to infection, or when corruption attracts corruption, may in fact be the primary point of Mercutio's Queen Mab's speech. When Mercutio describes Queen Mab's mode of conveyance, her chariot and its many parts, her wagoner is a gnat, a sign of corruption, which is smaller than the round little worm that might be pricked from a lazy finger of a maid. But why would there be an infestation of worms in the lazy fingers of a maid? because her corrupting sin of idleness has manifested itself materially in the spontaneous generation of worms. We should note that Queen Mab does not just deliver dreams. She rides through the dreamers' brains and bodies, and then they dream of their own inclinations, as already determined by their status or their occupation. Lovers dream of love, lawyers dream of fees, courtiers dream of suits, and soldiers of battles. Mab's demonic visitations produce an internal response, but the response is formed by the dreamer's predispositions. The filthy air or the emanating stars may deliver the plague, but the plague finds its habitation in the already corrupted body. So in The Wonderful Year, Thomas Dekker tells this story of a bride and a bridegroom intending to marry at a time when so many coffins pestered London churches that there was no room left for the weddings. Fearing death, the bridegroom works even faster to bring about the marriage, he being wrought by all possible art he could use to shorten the expected hour and bring it nearer, for he feared the interception of the parents. He would often prophetically tell her that sure he would never live to enjoy her. And then in a macabre turn, the bride takes sick at the wedding itself. Recalling Romeo's jealousy of death as Juliet's paramour, Dekker emphasizes how, quote, death rudely lay with her and spoiled her of a maidenhead in spite of her husband. The bridegroom sees that moment that his divination comes true. The rosemary that was washed in sweet water is set out the bridal and is now wet in tears to furnish her burial. Doth not Rosemary and Romeo begin with the letter R? The nurse asks, recalling that Juliet had the prettiest playful sentences on Romeo and Rosemary, a flower frequently used at weddings and funerals. You might remember Capulet's cry, our bridal flowers serve for a buried corpse. Rosemary signifies the rituals of both life and death, of womb and tomb, but it also promises hope, for it was thought to be an efficacious herb in the prevention of the plague. Indeed, Juliet's aphorisms of Romeo's name may also refer to the plant's increased worth in plague time. Romeo, which had wont to be sold for 12 pence an armful, now went for 6 shillings a handful. As we were told from the start of the play, Romeo and Juliet are death-marked. Even when Romeo willfully and lethally corrupts his own body with the apothecary's poison, Shakespeare reminds us of putrefying bodies, of the decay that breeds bad air and worms and disease. Here, here will I remain, Romeo concludes, with the worms that are Juliet's chambermaids. Surprisingly, the play makes no reference to the possibility of the lover's transcendence after death. Stressing only carpe diem, or seize the day, Romeo and Juliet may strike us as a stubbornly material play in its refusal to imagine the lovers in a posthumous reunion. But the absence of imagining an afterlife for the lovers could be attributed to the tragedy's representation of a plague culture in which vitality is found more in putrefaction and corruption than in vivacity or growth. As walking carrion infested with worms that may attract contagion, all the residents of Verona are plagued, whether we identify what plagues them as demonic spirits, the sin of cankerous rage, or raging pestilence. If love is to exist in this world, Romeo and Juliet must make haste, for at their backs they can hear Queen Mab's Antony-driven chariot drawing near. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions if there are any.
Yes, I have a question. This idea of the plague finds a home in those susceptible to it because of their corruption. Is that why they would be quarantined in homes and all might die without much sympathy from neighbors?
So yes, I think you can perhaps infer a little moral judgment going on here, right? that there may be a way in which those who caught the plague could be blamed for having caught it for ethical or moral or sinful reasons, right? That then it's kind of put to the test, right, when you enclose people who are not yet infected together with those who are infected. Sometimes not everyone did get infected. So there would then be that question. Why do some catch it and others do not? But that could, I think, be an interesting explanation for a kind of lack of sympathy that some of the writers were pointing to, a feeling as though people didn't care about those who'd been quarantined with the ill.
What would Shakespeare do with COVID?
Well, I think that we're getting a little glimpse, maybe, of what he would do with COVID. I mean, I've told this little story before, but I was so struck by it. When we were first told to stay indoors, I was taking a walk. You know, we could still go out into the greenways, and I was taking a walk, and I heard this rustling in the woods. And when I turned to look to see what it was, I discovered that it was two teenagers who were, together in nature. And it struck me as a kind of Romeo and Juliet moment, and that the kind of desperation that someone might feel to feel life, right? To feel another person, to connect to them, if you're being, forcefully separated, that I wonder if that isn't something we're already seeing with the young people who, we could go into all the kinds of psychological, developmental reasons why young people don't want to necessarily follow the rules. They're, they take risks. It's natural for them at that age. But I think there would be maybe a little bit of a sympathy on Shakespeare's part, because that's what I see in Romeo and Juliet, is a sympathy in some ways, as well as a recognition, as the friar tells them, that, why are you going so fast? Those who move this fast stumble. And it's youth. It's intemperate youth and passion. And that passion combined with being restricted, right? I think he would have a good analysis of that, as well as the sympathy for it.
Thank you. And I just have a comment from a listener. Thank you for this excellent lecture. Its relevance to current times made it intriguing.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Well, yes. I mean, I think that you can certainly understand how narratives are formed based on these kinds of events, and that you could spin that narrative either way. And so, yes, there was a lot of sermonizing about sort of end of the world and signs of that this is all deserved punishment, and that if we don't reform morally, that more is to come. So that was often a tack that was taken. I do think that thinking about this idea of whether the corruption of the disease is attracted to a kind of moral/physical corruption within might have complications in relation to, say, a predestinarian theology, where maybe some people are already sort of designated for this kind of punishment. But you could always flip it on its head and say that this kind of, that you're being tested and punished in a way because God favors you. So that's the thing, is that you could work it in a lot of different directions. But yes, there was a lot of sort of gloom and doom about the moral state, certainly of the cities. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Floyd-Wilson. We appreciate you being with us tonight.
Yes, of course. Happy to be here. Thank you. Thanks so much.